to this Congress's efforts, our states will receive billions of dollars for broadband infrastructure and expanded coverage. These resources must also be as inclusive as possible. The infrastructure law creates an affordability connectivity benefit, which will help low-income families afford internet access, a benefit that will reach about 27% of Californians who could otherwise miss out on the opportunities broadband coverage provides. Third, the value of our infrastructure investments is also grounded in economic opportunity. Analysis of the new law consistently indicate that these improvements will create hundreds of thousands of middle-class jobs and training opportunities. This is an investment in economic growth and financial security that American households need to recover fully from the pandemic crisis. The infrastructure law's investments also significantly address the grave climate and disaster resilience challenges that we face. I believe that this Congress needs to do as much as possible to support the green energy economy and to protect our constituents from the effects of climate change. The infrastructure law takes an historic step by focusing resources on electric vehicle infrastructure and on climate resiliency. It invests $7.5 billion to build out the first ever national network of EV chargers in the United States, including at least $380 million in my home state. It also provides funding to improve protection against natural disasters and to invest in weatherization that will reduce energy costs for families. As this subcommittee knows, I care deeply about wildfire mitigation and disaster relief. I've seen firsthand the toll that natural disasters can take on the mental, physical, and economic well-being of my district's residents. The infrastructure law focuses on resiliency funding, including $85 million to protect Californians against wildfires. It represents a much needed and long overdue investment in our constituents and their futures. As implementation of the new law moves forward, I believe it is extremely important for our subcommittee members to examine the impacts of these investments on our districts. That's why I brought together our panel of witnesses today to share their expertise. The legislation's goals enjoy strong bipartisan support across our country. I very much look forward to discussing with our witnesses just how these goals are becoming a reality. And now I'd like to welcome to the subcommittee again our colleague and now as ranking member, Mr. Kelly. I recognize you, Mr. Kelly, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Hey, thank you, Chairman. And it's good to be with you all. With Devin leaving and everybody kind of ratcheting up, and now Adrian's no longer the ranking member on this committee, I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you because we've done a lot of things together already. Now, but we're not going to agree on everything. Now, the topic of this hearing is the economic impact of federal infrastructure investment. So with the jobless recovery and inflation fueled by inefficient spending, most families don't really feel like things are getting better. Housing is getting more expensive. Groceries are getting more expensive. Transportation is getting more expensive. Gasoline, both regular gas and diesel, is getting more expensive. It was 5 degrees in Butler, Pennsylvania this morning when I got up. And a lot of the people in the district I represent, they heat their home. Their energy source is propane. That's up over 52%. That's just unworkable in anybody's world. Americans need real infrastructure investment, not trillions of dollars in more reckless spending. Now, just 2 weeks ago, a bridge collapsed in Pittsburgh, not too far from my district, sending several people to the hospital. 5 cars and a Port Authority bus were on the bridge at the time. Now, this is the kind of real infrastructure investment that we need. Now, too often, what Democrats offer as infrastructure is just a redistribution of taxpayer money for various social or climate priorities instead of on highways, roads, rivers, and bridges and runways. This approach ignores glaring short-term needs and fails to address the long-term investments that will increase our economic prosperity. The Biden administration's command and control approach only makes matters worse. For instance, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials has commented that the administration's fix-it-first policy prevents states from using federal highway dollars to improve local infrastructure in a way that works best for each unique scenario. Now, AASHTO is not considered a conservative group or a pro-business group. It's a bipartisan group of transportation officials closest to the local action. By that means they are the closest to the people, the very people that we all represent. And this is not what the people were told was happening when the infrastructure legislation was being debated. White House folks are trying to rewrite, once again, what the people wanted and needed, which is more money for roads and bridges, not money for EV subsidies and charging stations. I've told my liberal friends, if you want to reduce highways and build more bike lanes, then do it. But in my towns and cities that I represent, our local officials should decide if they simply want more roads and bridges that don't collapse during rush hour. Project proposals are often sent to the bottom of the pile if they add new general purpose travel lanes serving single occupancy vehicles. And that means if you like to ride around in your own car or your own truck, you're a problem because you're getting more than other people. We should pack them all together and make them use public transportation. And any project requiring a new right-of-way is ineligible for fast-track National Environmental Policy Act. The administration wants special interest climate restrictions attached to infrastructure spending, which will limit the effectiveness and timeliness of investments. The result will be aggravated congestion, avoidable CO2 emissions, bottleneck supply chains, and disappointed American drivers, once again, stuck in traffic. Now, I'm sure we're going to hear from a friend of mine, Mark McClymans, interesting guy, and I'll get a chance to introduce him after a while. But this is a guy who's actually boots on the ground. This is a guy who wakes up way before the sun comes out and works way beyond the time that it goes down for one reason and one reason only. He operates a very successful business that he bought from his father and has continued to build. All he's looking for is improved infrastructure. Now, the nice thing about him is that he not only uses the infrastructure, he helps build it. Now, it seems that whatever the intended goal, Democrats make sure that taxpayer dollars are spent as inefficiently as possible. We are going to spend $1.2 trillion of taxpayer dollars to get $120 billion in hard infrastructure investments. That's 12 cents of every dollar. Now, since I spent my life in an automobile industry, I can tell you that I don't think a 10% return on investment is worthy of a pat in the back. Republicans and Democrats do have a shared interest in making real infrastructure investments to help American families, small businesses, and communities. I know we all feel that way. Somehow we get off the path of where it is we're trying to go. And our views get blurred for whatever reason, and I don't know why it is. Now, our Republican colleagues worked hard on this bill in Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Their approach would cut red tape and ensure that any taxpayer dollars spent on infrastructure will go to things towards Americans care about. That's like roads and bridges and runways and railways and rivers and all the different things in broadband that we really do need to work on. And forget the waste and the pork projects, please. Unfortunately, this administration's wasteful spending had real economic consequences. They failed the policies of the past year and have led to the highest inflation in over 40 years with no end in sight. And according to Moody's, American families are paying at least $250 more every month just to keep up with higher prices. Guys, they're not getting ahead. They're getting further behind. The burden of inflation falls disproportionately on low to moderate income households, and that is the most regressive tax. Of course, the response to this crisis is to call for even more government spending, as well as higher taxes on Main Street, crushing mandates, and more bureaucratic control. American families cannot afford any more of these failed policies. I hope our colleagues will take this opportunity to abandon some of these wasteful spending plans, set aside tax hikes, and work across the aisle to help American families and small businesses that have been struggling throughout this pandemic. We can and should use the trillions, I'm saying trillions, not billions or millions, trillions of dollars we've already spent in a more efficient way. We have just passed over $30 trillion in debt, and our unfunded policies carry us up over $130 trillion. Gang, this is so far out of sight, we can't begin to imagine what it's going to do to our economy in the future. We can't afford to keep doing things that hurt their average American family every single day. And it affects their take-home pay. And believe me, I know that because on the 6th and 21st of every month, I sign checks. Mike, you did it in your business. I'm just telling you, there's a better way for us to spend our money. Just be realistic about it. So I'm looking forward to this today. I think we got a great panel. I think we got a great group of people on board with us. And I think, at the end of the day, let's stop doing what we think is good for Democrats or Republicans, and let's just start doing things that are good for our fellow Americans. Thanks so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Please note the generosity extended to the gentleman's first meeting as ranking member. Without objection, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. And I want to thank at this time our witnesses for taking the time to appear before us today and for sharing their expertise on this very important issue. I'm going to introduce the witnesses. We'll first hear from Dr. Sean Wilson, is the Secretary of Louisiana Department of Transportation and has been a tireless advocate for issues affecting the transportation and development of the state. He was elected the first African-American president of the American Association of Highway and Transportation Officials in 2021. Next, we'll hear from Commissioner Victoria Sheehan, who is the commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Transportation, where she oversees the agency with a dedication to providing safe and efficient transportation systems. She brings transportation engineering and management expertise to her role as commissioner. She's also a member of ASHTO's and executive committee and serves as the chair of the Strategic Management Committee, Transportation Policy Forum, and Knowledge Management Committees. Then we'll hear from Jung Lee, who is the deputy director, and chief policy officer of ASHTO's. He leads the organization's transportation policy work and is a key liaison between ASHTO and Congress, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and other organizations. He previously worked at the Federal Highway Administration and began his tenure at ASHTO in 2017. I'll now turn to our colleague, Mr. Kildee, to offer an introduction of the next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate you holding this hearing and allowing me to participate. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha to testify today at our hearing on the historic investments that this Congress has made in America's infrastructure, in our economic competitiveness. And many of you have gotten to know Dr. Mona. She has testified before Congress on several occasions. And as I said, we call her Dr. Mona. She is a Michigan State University pediatrician who runs a children's medical clinic in my hometown of Flint. I may have on occasion mentioned my hometown of Flint. She's the hero who exposed the water crisis in Flint. When state officials were telling Flint residents that the water was fine, Dr. Mona exposed through her analysis of children's blood lead levels that there was something deeply wrong. She also leads the Flint Lead Exposure Registry to help Flint and communities across the country work to minimize the impact of lead exposure on people's health. In fact, this week, I reintroduced my Flint Registry Reauthorization Act, bipartisan legislation to fund the registry for the next decade and to continue its critical work. I especially want to thank my colleagues, Representative Moore, Representative Sewell, Representative Larson, for their past support of this really important legislation. Dr. Mona truly embodies the spirit of the people of Flint. She's persistent, she's unwavering in her convictions, she's an incredible advocate for children, and so I'm really glad to have her here to talk about the impact that these investments, particularly in our water infrastructure, will have on communities. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kildee, and welcome, Dr. Mona. Next, I'll yield to our ranking member, Mr. Kelly, to introduce the next witness.
Oh, thanks, Chairman. Listen, Mark McClymans and I go back a long way. I think if you look at people, and the great American dream, right, is always to start small, start your own company, try to build it and do an awful lot in your community. Mark's dad started this business that Mark bought from him, by the way. He wasn't left to him, he bought it from him. He started driving a truck at 18. Now, Mark purchased the company from his dad, George McClymans, who's passed, and incorporated under the name of McClymans Supply and Transit Company. Now, think about this. This kid started, I still call him kid. I mean, I think he's a couple years younger than me. I'm trying to stay young here. But so he buys this business from his dad. They had 7 trucks. 7 trucks. Today they have over 400 trucks. And maybe when he gets a chance to talk, he can give you a little bit of an idea of what those trucks cost to buy. Now, through the years, the company's acquired 2 river terminals on the Ohio River and 2 rail terminals to expand its logistic capabilities. The company's base, customer base, has grown exponentially over the years. Now, Mark has done a lot in his community. He does a lot in the area we live in. And the key to having Mark on today, when you talk about infrastructure, he's a guy that not only uses infrastructure every single day, who runs a business and has to make payroll a couple of times a month and have great benefits for his people, but he's a guy who builds roads. He's a guy that actually does the work that we're talking about when it comes to infrastructure. So I'm really proud to have him on board today. He is truly the red, white, and blue of what makes this country so great, and that is Americans doing everything they can, not only to better themselves, but to better their families and the communities they work in. I could not be more happy than to have Mark on the line today. And this is a guy, the boots on the ground. He's not a theorist. He's not a guy that says, well, I think this would work. He's a guy that's been through the ups and downs, had his nose bloodied, has been knocked down, got back up off the mat, and got back and got it rolling again. So I'm so happy to have Mark here, and I think you're going to really enjoy his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, and welcome, Mr. McClymans. To the witnesses, each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety. I would ask today that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. And to help you manage that time, please keep an eye on the clock that has been pinned to your screen. If you go over your time, I'll notify you with a tap of something on my computer. And I appreciate your understanding of the time constraints. We'll start now. I'd like to call on Dr. Wilson. Dr. Wilson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Kelly and members of the subcommittee. And thank you all for the opportunity to discuss the major economic impacts related to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as IIJA. As the chairman said, my name is Sean Wilson, and I serve as the president of the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. Honored to be the first African American in that position. Thank you for that acknowledgement. I'm also proud to be secretary of the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development. I want to extend my gratitude to you and your colleagues in Congress and those specifically on the Ways and Means Committee for your leadership on the development of the IIJA. Stable and long-term policy and funding provided through a robust multi-year federal surface transportation bill remains a crucial element to our work every single day, not just here in Louisiana, but in other DOTs. Second, I'd like to share 2 emphasis areas that I'm leading as AASHTO president. The first is pathways to equity, and then the second is partnering to deliver. From a global pandemic to the effects of climate change, and even a more robust national discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion, state DOTs have stepped up and will continue to respond to these challenges and cultivate new partnerships in those processes. State DOTs have long recognized that a well-functioning and safe transportation system is the foundation of our economy. This 5-year surface transportation reauthorization underpins an IIJA that will provide economic benefits to the nation's businesses, workers, and families. It also allows state DOTs to continue to focus on issues such as safety. And this is personal for me in Louisiana, knowing that the number of people killed on our roadways are wholly unacceptable, and that safety remains a priority for every DOT across this country. On equity, the development of transportation systems has historically prioritized highways, not just by agencies, but by legislative bodies as well. These decisions often significantly impacted low-income communities, minority neighborhoods, non-drivers, and people in inaccessible locations, and people, of course, with disabilities. For Louisiana, the IIJA provides us with an opportunity to make much-needed improvements in communities impacted by the unfair and unjust decision-makings that took place in the past, and those that are consistent with the state's asset management plan. The Claiborne Corridor and I-49 Connector South, for example, are 2 projects that will benefit, I believe, from the dedicated and discretionary grant funding in the legislation, funding that will allow us to consider thoughtful and sustainable improvements to infrastructure in affected areas. Turning to workforce, our workforce is an urgent and critical issue for state DOTs. We're not immune to the workforce challenges being felt all across the country, and we will need to adjust to the culture and the new workforces to recruit and retain employees. You know, IIJA provided an increase in funding to state DOTs, and we're grateful for that. The ability to effectively utilize these resources depends upon having necessary workforces in place. Restructuring, providing increased diversity and inclusion, and greater employee buy-in and collaboration and organizational culture change may be required for us to be successful. In the world of resilience, the number of cost of natural disasters in the United States continues to increase at record-setting rates. In Louisiana, IIJA will provide us an opportunity to address those issues and to continue to develop a more resilient transportation system that will improve our ability to protect against, to respond to, and to recover from or mitigate natural and man-made disasters. And then specifically with regards to bridge investment, IIJA includes the largest such program since the construction of the interstate. This funding will greatly accelerate the progress states have made in reducing the number of bridges that are in poor condition. As part of IIJA here in Louisiana, we will continue a long-standing investment in bridges by allocating over the $1 billion over the next 5 years to rural and urban bridges alike that are in need of rehabilitation and replacement. So, as I close, I will tell you that AASHTO and state DOT members are fully devoted to supporting Congress and implementing the IIJA in order to ensure a full economic recovery and growth and enhance the quality of life through robust investments in infrastructure and transportation programs and projects. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to responding to your questions and expounding on what's in my written testimony. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Commissioner Sheehan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss how we can build the foundation for our nation's future through infrastructure investment. My name is Victoria Sheehan, and I'm proud to serve as Commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. I'm also the immediate past president of AASHTO. First, I'd like to echo Secretary Wilson's gratitude for your dedication and tireless leadership on development and delivery of the IIJA. We in New Hampshire look forward to putting $1.5 billion in highway and transit formula dollars to work over the next 5 years. And like Louisiana and the other states, we intend to compete for additional resources from the discretionary grant programs. Secondly, like Secretary Wilson, when I was AASHTO president from 2000 until 2021, I too had emphasis areas that reflect key priorities of the subcommittee. My emphasis areas were the value of transportation and workforce development. During my term, AASHTO was able to strengthen its efforts to help people better understand the value of transportation and how it impacts quality of life. On workforce development, we revamped AASHTO's leadership development and training programs and provided updated tools and guidance that help state DOTs capture the institutional knowledge of experienced technicians, engineers, and organizational leaders. But this afternoon, I'd like to touch on a few areas of importance to AASHTO and New Hampshire. While the IIJA funding is important, in the transportation sector, federal dollars play a relatively small role compared to the total investment made in the United States. According to the Congressional Budget Office, only 22.3% of total transportation funding for capital, operations, and maintenance activities comes from the federal government. The remainder represents state and local government spending. States have answered the call to action and increased transportation investment, with more than 2/3 of all states having successfully enacted transportation revenue packages over the past decade, including here in the Granite State. In addition, states continue to support a role for federal financing tools, given their ability to leverage scarce dollars that allow needed projects to benefit communities sooner. States also fully support building local government capacity to meet their priority transportation investment needs. In fact, viewing state investment in local and off-system projects only through the federal funding lens fails to recognize the full scope of state investments made on local transportation assets. According to Federal Highway, states collectively invested $26.7 billion of state funds for local roads and streets in 2019. While road capacity expansion has largely correlated with population growth, it's important to note that most of this has not occurred on state-owned facilities. The vast majority of the increase in highway capacity occurred on locally owned facilities, frequently on low-volume roads. For many years, state DOTs have been making the case that investment is needed to maintain and preserve our existing infrastructure. Instead of a worst-first approach, investment is needed to keep infrastructure in good condition while also addressing the backlog of deferred investment. Over the last 8 years, New Hampshire has made preserving and maintaining our existing system a priority, especially our bridge infrastructure. While much needed, focusing on preservation, rehab, and replacement of existing infrastructure has limited our capacity to deliver other types of projects that are important to communities. With the dedicated bridge funds provided in the IIJA, we can now increase our investment in bridges, but also take flexible formula dollars that were previously committed to bridge work and use them for other types of projects. State DOTs strive to serve as stewards of an integrated multimodal transportation system that achieves economic, environmental, and social goals. Achieving these goals depends on meaningful collaboration with all relevant stakeholders, and we're always looking to add tools that create engagement opportunities and enable greater levels of participation. Specifically, state DOTs are committed to enhancing the decision-making processes, focused on advancing racial justice and incorporating equity, diversity, and inclusion in all aspects of transportation. Lastly, as you heard from Secretary Wilson, state DOTs are managing broadband deployment on their properties to enhance mobility and increase safety on the nation's roadways, as well as providing improved access to digital resources, especially for rural communities across the United States. New Hampshire now plans to leverage federal funds to expedite the delivery of high-speed internet to underserved rural and urban communities throughout the state. AASHTO and its state DOT members appreciate the subcommittee's interest and oversight on the implementation of the IIJA. Thank you again for the honor and opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Sheehan. Now I'll recognize Mr. Lee for 5 minutes. Mr. Lee, you may proceed.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to further discuss critical economic benefit of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. My name is Jung Lee, and I serve as Deputy Director and Chief Policy Officer for AASHTO. We're grateful for this committee's leadership on getting the IIJA across the finish line. It's not lost on me that the IIJA was enacted almost 2 years after the January 2020 Ways and Means hearing entitled Paving the Way for Funding and Financing Infrastructure Investments, in which I last had the great honor to testify before this body. In order to immediately deliver on the public benefits of the IIJA, AASHTO is currently working on an implementation plan to convey optimal program design recommendations to our federal partners. 1. Federal executive agencies should implement the law as soon as practicable. 2. Where a range of possible legislative interpretations exist, federal partners should provide flexibility that best meets unique needs of each state. And 3. AASHTO's ongoing input will be critical in the development of federal regulations, guidance, and policies. State DOTs are thankful that the IIJA at its core includes a 5-year reauthorization of federal highway, safety, transit, and passenger rail programs with $567 billion in total transportation funding. This federal investment complements ongoing state DOT investments in all modes of transportation. In 2019, state DOTs invested $20.8 billion in public transportation, almost double the federal investment. Also that year, 25 state agencies provided $750 million in funding support to Amtrak and almost half of its riders nationwide. For civil aviation, states helped to support 4 million jobs and generated $850 billion in total economic activity in 2020. State DOTs are also on the cutting edge of transportation technology and innovation, addressing emerging issues including connected and automated vehicles, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, unmanned aerial systems, and shared mobility. Given the public's high expectations of the IIJA, we're concerned that many of its programs cannot be put to use until the full fiscal year 2022 appropriations package is enacted. Without it, states, local governments, and public transit agencies will not be able to access the IIJA's 20% funding increase for highway formula and 30+% increase for public transit formula programs, along with new transportation initiatives in the law. Given the tremendous bipartisan effort that Congress put into the IIJA, we ask for your help in putting not some, but all of the IIJA to work as soon as possible. Even with IIJA enactment, we as a nation continue to struggle with the solvency of the Federal Highway Trust Fund. With $272 billion transferred from the general fund to keep it solvent since 2008, we recognize the urgent need for a permanent revenue solution to stabilize our transportation investment for the long term. According to the Congressional Budget Office, dedicated revenues, including the federal gas tax, will only be able to support about half of ongoing spending, and the trust fund will face a $215 billion cumulative cash shortfall through 2031. AASHTO strongly supports the new National Motor Vehicle Per Mile User Fee pilot program in the IIJA. State DOTs are at the forefront of this research, and their best practices must inform this national effort. State DOTs also express our appreciation to this committee for doubling the private activity bond volume cap for qualified highway and surface freight facilities to $30 billion. A critical part of the IIJA are discretionary grant programs, which have increased substantially and which support some of the most important congressional priorities. Key issues to address include building up the institutional capacity and resources necessary for eligible recipients to successfully apply for and deliver projects, especially at the local level, as well as for federal agencies to efficiently evaluate applications and oversee funded projects. Also, there's great difficulty in planning multi-year state and local capital programs due to the low probability of successfully obtaining discretionary grants. State DOTs are eager to share their institutional expertise and resources, especially with smaller local partners, to make sure their common priorities are addressed. To close, state DOTs remain fully committed to strategically managing its assets under the IIJA. Concerted efforts by every state DOT over the past decade have resulted in the number of bridges in poor condition decreasing by 18%, and the amount of interstate pavement in good condition increasing by 10%. Thank you again for the honor and opportunity to testify today, and I'm looking forward to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Now I'll recognize Dr. Mona. Dr. Mona, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Kelly, and all the members of the subcommittee for this opportunity. A special thank you to my good friend, Congressman Kildee. As Congressman Kildee said, over the years, I've had the great privilege of testifying before different congressional committees, and I'm usually sharing the Flint story and sharing what we can do better to protect our nation's kids, like strengthening regulations, investing in public health, and fixing infrastructure that makes people sick. However, today, more than anything, I am here to say thank you. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is a really big deal. It respects science, learns from history, advances equity, and truly protects our children. The return on investments will be rewarded not only with profound economic savings, but also with generations of children who are healthier, stronger, and smarter. That's pretty priceless. But we're not here to talk about kids, but it's hard for me because I'm a pediatrician. But we're here to talk about roads and bridges and pipes. And I just happen to have a pipe with me, a little show and tell. So this is a lead pipe that was excavated from the Flint home of Oscar and Elizabeth Brown. In the 1950s, the Browns moved from Mississippi to Flint as part of the Great Migration North. And the Browns were hoping to build a foundation of prosperity and opportunity and equality. Mr. Brown worked at the Buick plant, and they lived in Flint, raising and nurturing generations of their children. And for decades, they drank water from this pipe. And they assumed, like so many of us do, that when you turn on your tap, that your water is safe to drink. And the Browns were still in Flint in 2014 when a state-appointed emergency manager changed our water source. And the water that began to flow through this pipe was super corrosive, and it dissolved the lead. And the lead came out of these pipes and into our drinking water and into the bodies of unsuspecting residents. And the entire Brown family, including Dana, their great-grandson, continued to drink water from this pipe. And lead in water is sneaky. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. But I think you can appreciate that it's kind of like a straw. But in this case, it's a poisonous straw. We know there's no safe level of lead. It's a neurotoxin. It can erode cognition and twist behavior and diminish health. Little Dana did suffer health problems, including seizures. Thousands of Flint kids drank from these straws, and millions of US kids continue to drink from these straws. Flint has opened the nation's eyes to the pervasive inadequacy of our water infrastructure systems, from drinking water contamination like lead or PFAS, to the lack of running water in rural and tribal communities, to waste and sewage failures in places like Alabama, and the lack of infrastructure resilience as we saw during the Texas freeze. It makes economic sense to invest in water infrastructure. The initial $15 billion investment for lead line replacement is expected to generate a net societal return of $5 billion. You know, holding this pipe, I think often about what it represents. I think about the Brown family and how they moved to Flint for a better life, and how despite their best efforts, policies and prejudices failed generations of their family, making it really difficult to be healthy. But more than a symbol of failure, this excavated lead pipe symbolizes hope, because it's in my hand and it's not in the ground anymore. In Flint and all over, like Newark, New Jersey, we have begun to dig up these poisonous straws. And soon, thanks to your leadership, this symbol of hope will multiply. And while I'm primarily here to say thank you, I note that there is more to be done to fully fund lead pipe replacement. Congress must find a way to appropriate the remaining $10 billion that was in the Build Back Better plan. I urge you to make that a priority. In closing, I ask you, what is infrastructure if not the building of a robust foundation for our nation's greatest and most valuable resource, our children? Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Last, we'll hear from Mr. McClymans. Mr. McClymans, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you for joining us.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Kelly, and the members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear today. The McClymans trucking business was formed in 1945 by my father, George R. McClymans, upon returning home from World War II. He launched the business by purchasing his first truck, a single-axle truck which he would haul sand and gravel and coal to people's houses and shovel it into their basement for heat. Along with my mother Gladys, he operated a family business under the name George McClymans Trucking while they raised 6 children. The company grew upon developing a great reputation of service and honesty, winning over a network of customers and drivers throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of those customers are still with us today, but most of those drivers have retired, and the shrinking driver pool has become a real challenge to replace them. In 1983, I purchased and incorporated the company's McClymans Supply and Transit. Since incorporation, McClymans Supply and Transit has grown to include a variation of truck services, 4 terminals, including an over-the-road division. As we developed a network of diverse regional customers, we started an affiliated company for logistics. MST Logistics was founded in 2004, to expand our ability to service customers by brokering freight and other with 2 reputable carriers and owner-operators. I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective on the infrastructure and the economy. Truck drivers are an indispensable part of the economy and the way of life. The trucking industry moves over 70% of the U.S. freight tonnage every year, and many communities rely exclusively on trucks to send and receive their products. The industry is one of the country's largest employers, with over 3.5 million drivers, or 1 out of every 18 American jobs. Increasingly, truck drivers are stuck with highway congestion and other inefficiencies. One report showed that the traffic jams added nearly $75 billion to the cost of freight transportation every year. The same report showed that truck drivers sat in traffic for 1 billion hours in 2016, burning nearly 7 billion gallons of fuel, about 13% of the industry's total fuel use, and resulting in significant excess CO2 emissions. We must address these bottlenecks in important freight corridors to ensure we don't cause more harm to our economy and the environment. Because of the global pandemic, many Americans have learned firsthand about the importance of a strong and well-functioning transportation system. When the trucks are not able to operate efficiently, the entire supply chain faces a slowdown. Consumers may see empty shelves, and American businesses may not be able to obtain products in a timely fashion. All infrastructure spending isn't created equal. The United States has some critical needs that should be a priority, especially considering our current supply chain challenges. The infrastructure bill last year included some long overdue investment in our highways and bridges, yet there is a lot more investment needed. It also ignored some of the key shortfalls like truck parking. Instead of spending money on special interest ideas like EV charging stations or unnecessary studies, Congress should put the federal dollars into projects that will meet our most pressing needs. When truck drivers are forced to spend money to comply to new government regulations or mandates, we must either absorb those costs when the market is tight or pass them along to the customer. In the first case, that leaves fewer resources for us to invest in our businesses to ensure we get the goods or parts to the end user. If the costs are passed on to the customer, the result is higher prices, fueling the painful inflation we've seen in recent months. In both cases, the ultimate harm falls on the hardworking Americans. Most of the family businesses that have incorporated since the 1980s are sub-S corporations, so the owners pay these taxes personally, and any increase in taxes takes away reinvestment dollars, and any decrease in taxes allows the owners to increase their investment into equipment, new hires, and the benefits of their employees. The 2017 tax law provided tax relief to many businesses with lower tax rates and expensing for equipment purchases. The plan to repeal so-called stepped-up basis would have worsened the effects of the death tax. It would force generational businesses like ours to sell off pieces in order to pay the tax bill to the IRS. In addition, proposals to impose a truck-only tax on vehicle miles traveled would be discriminatory against millions of truckers who deliver essential products to American families. While truck accounts only for 4% of the vehicles on the highway and 9% of all vehicles miles traveled nationally, they pay nearly half of the tab for the entire highway trust fund. If excise taxes to pay for roads and bridges are increased,
Thank you, Mr. McClyman, for your testimony. And now, without objections, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes to question our witnesses. We will not observe the Gibbons rule in this remote setting and will instead go in the order of seniority, switching between majority and minority members. Members are reminded to unmute yourselves when you're recognized for your 5 minutes. I'll begin by recognizing myself. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the bipartisan infrastructure law focuses both on traditional infrastructure like roads and bridges and also on innovative infrastructure such as broadband. Given our experience with the pandemic, engaging in business, education, or other activities online has become even more important. Dr. Wilson, could you elaborate on how you see the bipartisan infrastructure law helping broadband deployment efforts and the impacts you've seen regarding greater broadband access? I also invite other panelists to add their own experiences if they wish. Dr. Wilson?
Certainly. So I am excited to see not just the investment in which you suggested are traditional elements of transportation, but these new innovative tools of broadband. Here in Louisiana, we have a pretty aggressive effort that deals with 3 issues, specifically access, affordability, and digital literacy. Collectively, all 3 of those assets, much will be supported with IIJA. For example, in terms of access, the governor has a program called Gumbo, native to Louisiana. It's called Granting Unserved Municipalities Broadband Opportunities. We're awarding over $711 million in grants 440 million of those $700+ million are coming from IIJA. The value of that will be about 215,000 households, over 14,000 businesses are all going to have access to affordable broadband services. Why is that important? I will tell you. If you look just at the pandemic and what happened in terms of needing to provide educational support for our young people all across the state, there's a tremendous opportunity there with increased broadband services. And then also from a healthcare perspective and telemedicine, what we can provide not just to rural communities, but also to urban communities that will make it affordable and easy for families to access good advice and good information. Here in Louisiana, we've instituted a Dig Once policy. We are working to close the illiteracy gap in terms of digitalization and what's happening in that space, particularly for Louisianians that are 18 to 64 years old. We anticipate and estimate that there's over 462,000 people that are experiencing less than optimum lifestyle because of the digital gaps that exist or the digital illiteracies in our communities. So IIJA has really made an effort for us to not just continue to invest our local resources, but also to augment that in a way that will allow both commercial entities as well as state governments to benefit from those investments.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to comment quickly?
Just, real
Sure.
quick, if it's
Recognize.
okay. As a physician, the ability to provide telemedicine has been critical during the pandemic. And that's been very challenging to reach families who don't have reliable access to the internet. So it impacts directly their health. Also, as a pediatrician, we see the consequences of the digital divide in education, as Dr. Wilson said. Kids who did not have access to the internet during the probably 1 year of remote learning, that impacted their achievement even wider than other kind of disparities that they were struggling with. So this is kind of a basic necessity, basic part of our infrastructure that we need to be supporting that also, once again, directly impacts the health and success, especially of our children.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lee, I'd like to turn to you on an issue that's very near and dear to me, and that's climate change and disaster resilience. Every year, millions of Americans, including many of my constituents, feel the impact of climate change. Droughts, flooding, wildfires, and other extreme weather events caused close to $150 billion in losses just last year. More important, the emotional and physical toll that these disasters exact on Americans who lose their homes, their jobs, or their health is just absolutely incalculable. Yet resiliency and mitigation issues are often overlooked when it comes to traditional infrastructure investments. Can you speak to how the infrastructure law the bipartisan infrastructure law invest in resiliency and the impacts of those investments for our constituents who are at risk?
Thank you for the great question, Mr. Chairman. I think one of the hallmarks of the infrastructure bill is a concerted and very intentional effort to improve the resiliency of our entire infrastructure capital stock, including those concerning transportation assets as well. And I think the combined approach of the formula programs in the bill that provides that ample flexibility to meet each state's unique circumstances and needs, but by increasing eligibility to include previously ineligible activities to strengthen resiliency across the board on all the core formula program categories, provides that basic foundation for every state to be able to have the necessary dollars and resources to tackle resilience issues. And then combined with the discretionary grant programs, states and local partners have the opportunity to further supplement the core formula program funds to be able to invest in additional programs and projects of their highest priorities to increase resiliency.
And you want to say anything on what this law will mean in regard to developing our workforce and creating good paying jobs?
That's also a great theme of the bill. And, I think certainly we have great state stories from our Secretary Wilson and Commissioner Sheehan, who can share more direct experience as well. But one of the things that we are looking at is, as President Sean Wilson of AASHTO mentioned, expanding our partners with non-traditional entities. We're working with a group called Center for Employment Opportunities out of New York City, for example. Their goal is to help previously incarcerated individuals come back into the workforce, start a career, and they're helping to place, workers on the state DOT maintenance task forces, as an example. And we're looking to scale up those types of opportunities throughout the country.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized for questions for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman. I just want to go back to Mr. McClymans, because I think that somebody who's in the private sector, and all our, everybody on the panel talked very clearly about infrastructure. And I think that all of us agree that that is a wise investment. But then the question then becomes, what do you mean by infrastructure? And then all of a sudden it gets blurred. Almost every one of you talked about actual hard infrastructure and not some of the things that are proposed in this spending. I got to tell you, 88 cents of every dollar is not going to the things that you think 12 cents of every dollar is. But I want to talk with Mark about this because of his business. Mark, so when I look at your total cost of operation and the effect that inflation's having on it, your availability of talent, and then the actual roads that you travel on and the taxes that you pay, whether it's for fuel or all the different things. If you can just kind of give us a really brief rundown, because I think sometimes when you're in these elected offices, you kind of get away from where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, or where the steel wheels on a steel rail, or however you want to describe this, to get things moving. Can you give us a little idea of the structure of your business and infrastructure and the taxes that you have to pay? And I think I remember you said you have 400 trucks. So whatever you're talking about, it's times 400. If you can just kind of walk through that, if you can do that right now, I'd appreciate it.
Well, sure, Mike. Thanks. Our small company runs 25 million miles a year. Our average truck gets 5 miles to the gallon. There's $1 tax on every gallon that we burn in Pennsylvania. And besides that, we pay the turnpike fees. So we're well over $1 million a year in turnpike fees and $5 million a year in road use taxes just for diesel fuel, not counting the license plates or the user fees. It's very expensive.
Yeah, so I was trying to figure it out because every time I gas up, I know there's a federal tax that's already built in, then there's the state tax, and I think Pennsylvania is one of the top 3 states as far as sales tax is concerned. And I think for every gallon, I may be wrong on this, but I think for every gallon of diesel fuel, there's 74 cents per gallon for diesel and 58 cents per gallon for gasoline. That's, when I look at what it is, you're talking 5 miles to a gallon and the hard work that you're all doing, that's really expensive. But you're building roads, you're doing all the things that we're talking about right now, the dredging that needs to take place in our rivers, the replacement of a lot of our bridges because they're failing in too many different ways. But for the rest of the panel, so when you talk about all this, because this is actually a jobs bill, right? I think, Doctor, what do you think? I mean, each of you, these are jobs bills that we're talking about.
Well, Congressman, I will suggest to you, building infrastructure does create jobs that are going to sustain our economy.
Yeah.
And much like what we've talked about in workforce, a great deal of the investments that we're receiving in Louisiana from IIJA is about $6 billion. It's about $1 billion more than what we would have received in the previous iteration, and it restored all of our investment. 100% of that is going to actual projects that are going to speak to the trucking community, for example. Yeah. When I think about congestion points, when I think about our intermodal connectors, when I think about the bridges that are in poor condition, the over 700 in Louisiana that are going to be critical for the trucking community to move from the farm to the market, from the market to the port, and then to places all around the globe. Yep. I realize that these investments are hitting the bottom line of our trucking industry as well as our communities. Yep. From a job perspective. I can think about our workforce right now and partnerships that we've done with the construction sector, trying to replace the 85,000 drivers that are not there. All of these are projects that are going to receive the benefits of this investment. So I will tell you, 100% of what we're receiving is going on actual projects, whether they're ports, railroads, crossings, pipeline work.
Yeah, well, let me, just because we're on such a limited time, we feel the same way about this. I'm not worried about the money that we spend on infrastructure, really hard infrastructure. I'm talking about these other items that are in there that don't give you that type of a return. I just think just in Social Security and wage taxes, income taxes and everybody's paying. This is a jobs bill. But I'm talking, Doctor, if we're concentrating on hard infrastructure, which we all agree needs to be done, let's get that fixed first. And that'll help fix all these other things that we're still worried about. I want to go back to Mark for just a second, Mark, because I think it's really important. And please, I don't want anybody else in the panel to misunderstand me with this, because every one of your testimonies is great. And I've been to Flint and I've watched them make Chevy trucks and GMC trucks at the same place. I've watched the Buick plant. So Danny knows I'm familiar with Flint. But a lot of these cities are old and have been aging and have not been kept up to date. And that's why we're facing a big bill today, right? I live in a house that was built in 1917, and a house that was built in 1917 is like a person that's built in 1917. They need a lot of work to be done, most of it internal. So I just think that while we're at it today, Mark, just your idea on what it's going to take for us to get this in shape, because it's your wasted time on the highway also, where that engine's running, that you're burning up fuel, still paying taxes and all of it. I would just imagine, guess the average of one of your trucks. If you were to buy a new truck today, what's the cost to get a new truck?
Oh, you're over 200,000.
200,000. That's why I want our
Thank
panel
you.
to understand, because these things are
gentleman's
expensive.
time has expired.
Well, I thought you were going to be nice with me and let
Noted
me
that
have
we
more time.
Noted that we established that it cost over 200,000 to buy a truck. Mr. Doggett, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You have appropriately convened this on what is called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. But unfortunately, in Texas, it hasn't been very bipartisan. Every single Texas Republican voted no, rejected this bill. And yet we have immense mobility problems here in Austin, in urban areas across the state. And Texas is getting over $30 billion because of this bill. Wouldn't have gotten a dime if it had been up to the members of the Texas Republican delegation. I am concerned about addressing mobility, as most of our witnesses have mentioned, but I'm also concerned about the impact of the climate crisis. Here in Texas, we've had deep freezes, we've had flash floods, we've had droughts, we've had killer hurricanes. In the summer, it used to be hot or hotter. Now it's just hotter and hotter. Indeed, today is the 1-year anniversary of Governor Greg Abbott's deadly failure to weatherize our grid. We had a deep freeze here a year ago because there was not proper preparation, but gross negligence. Millions of Texas families suffered. There were a number of deaths, incredible loss of water and of electricity. Our Texas House colleagues, particularly Texas Representative Vicki Goodwin, is hosting a People's Summit at the Texas Capitol today to look at this tragedy and other ways that we can correct it. There is some support for upgrading our grid in the infrastructure bill, though most of the problems here are problems of a failure of state leadership and still the need for state action on this. I know, Secretary Wilson, that Louisiana, as our next door neighbor, is no stranger to extreme weather. Could you just comment briefly on how this infrastructure law will help us in meeting some of the challenges of the climate crisis?
Well, thank you for that comment, Congressman Doggett. I will tell you, Doggett, I'm sorry. I will tell you, we've evacuated people from Texas. Texas has helped us in these disasters. And you're right, this is where the rubber meets the road, and we're keeping people safe. DOTs around the country, including those especially in the South, are familiar with disasters and resilience issues. Over the last nearly 20 years, we've spent $16 billion on 28 declared disasters, some of that hitting your state. We see the value of IIJA helping us make investments, not just in very targeted programs, but in our entire construction program as it relates to incorporating a lens of resilience. We're looking at using scientific tools and data, having objective decision making, that the science will drive us as it relates to the strength of our electrical grid and greenhouse gases and climate change in its entirety, and maximizing our natural floodplains here in Louisiana, and finally establishing regional watershed-based managements of flood risk. We see the value that IIJA has created by instituting a program to address this resilience and will allow us to capitalize on it. And in a state that's a big energy producer, we actually adopted a climate change initiative here in the state of Louisiana that's going to change, I think, the way we create and treat weather and how we create response efforts in that regard. And so IIJA is going to provide the resources to institute resiliency in our regular programs. And that's the most comprehensive way to do it, as opposed to fixing something only to break again.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, let me ask you about this also. I find it rather unusual to see these claims that doing more to encourage electric vehicles is somehow a special interest matter. I'm the sponsor of the Electric Vehicle Charge Act, which is designed to try to get to support the other provisions in this infrastructure bill to expand the number of EV charging stations around the country, since hesitancy and concern about traveling long distances, like in the state of Texas, is discouraging people from electric vehicles. We know that transportation is the #1 source of carbon pollution in the United States. What role do you see, Mr. Lee, in having an effective EV charge infrastructure out there to support greener transportation in this century?
The infrastructure bill, Congressman, agrees with your priority on EV charging infrastructure deployment, addressing range anxiety by requiring the monies to be put into alternative fuel corridors that are designated, so that every 50 miles at least, you are going to be able to access EV charging infrastructure all throughout the corridor, all throughout the country.
So nothing special interest about it, just a way to have more mobility, address our mobility issues at the same time that we address the climate crisis. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of our witnesses for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. Now recognize Mr. Schweikert for 5 minutes to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me give a little bit of a sort of a Western view, because we all love to talk about infrastructure and support it, but I will argue that much of the model that's used, particularly on the roads and bridges, surface transportation, is from a different century. So look, there's been testimony on how fast the Highway Transportation Trust Fund bleeds out. But yet we have the Highway Trust Fund doing lots and lots of things that it was not originally designed for. And a good example here in Arizona, if you think about our water projects, our dams, the world's longest aqueduct, that was loans to the United States that we had to pay back. Our highway system in Maricopa County, our freeway system substantially have paid for that locally with our own half-cent sales tax, because we missed the largesse of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when the money was being handed out. So we built a modern system ourselves. And the frustration here is then we get memos saying the White House is suggesting move much of the money as the grants into immediate repairs. But if you're Arizona, like a couple of the other states of our members here, high growth, lots of inbound population, but our base infrastructure is actually fairly modern. Ours is not as much a focus on repair, it's on new corridors, new construction, and both the EPA requirements, the environmental permitting requirements, those things that become very difficult when you're doing new instead of repair. So one of the great faults in the design of the infrastructure bill, I think, was truly understanding the regional idiosyncrasies of how different someone on the East Coast or parts of California compared to those of us in the high growth desert areas of the Southwest. The other thing, it also, and I don't think this will be Republican or Democrat, but it is intensely frustrating. A couple years ago, we had some presentations, I think this was more in the science committees, on if you wanted to impact traffic, you wanted to impact air quality, that technology was the disruptor. A smart city type model where, stoplights, data, when the fire truck is on its way out, it synchronizes the stoplights. When the school is about to let out, that type of data infrastructure for moving traffic, particularly for those of us here in Arizona. Arizona is basically a ginormous suburb. The federal government owns the vast majority of our land. The vast majority of the population lives in one county. If I was going to turn to the witnesses and say, we here in Arizona recently had an occasion where a big rig truck drove without a driver autonomously. Very hopeful for productivity, because we need productivity to help knock down some of the inflation, also deal with the truck driver shortages, those sorts of things. That's the future. And the resources from the federal government should be focused on the interstate systems and the embracing of that technology that crosses state lines, and maybe instead of trying to finance my local streets. But if I wanted to find out in the professionals on the engineering side, who provides the best information, the best data on what the future actually looks like, and those things that are actually the steps up in productivity to help all of us. Any witness at all, because this is something we're always hunting for in our office, of what we should be reading to understand where we should be pushing the body, instead of trying to finance last century's infrastructure, financing the future. Any witness at all willing to share? And with that, Mr. Chairman, apparently that doesn't,
Well,
future
Congressman,
doesn't seem to be,
Congressman,
yes, please.
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
Sean Wilson.
Share with us.
So what I would suggest to you is your first statement about the need to invest in perhaps new capacity or modernized infrastructure using technology. You won't necessarily get resistance from my state and other states I'm aware of in our organization. We think those are decisions that are best left to states, and we think that working with our US DOT partners, we will achieve that. And then secondly, I think the bill does provide some interesting perspectives in terms of technology and how we're using that and how we're evolving in that space. But every state's going to be different in terms of their readiness to perhaps move into that space and in a robust way. And so giving them...
I hate to interrupt, but we actually did a little breakdown on the bill.
The gentleman's time has expired.
All right. With that,
Mr.
yield back,
Larson,
Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized to inquire for 5 minutes.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this informative hearing. I can't think of anything that's more vitally important to our districts than infrastructure improvement. I want to thank the panelists as well, and especially since along the East Coast, since we seem to be talking about East Coast and the deserts of the Southwest. The infrastructure system designed here back during the Eisenhower administration has long since been antiquated. And of course, the desire and need for intermodal transportation and connections is abundantly apparent as well. Dr. Wilson, I want to thank you for your testimony as well, and all the issues that you're facing down in Louisiana. In Hartford, Connecticut, we face a similar situation that you have down in the, I believe it's the Claiborne Expressway you alluded to. But highway designers back in the 50s managed to cut off the city of Hartford from its riverfront, the Connecticut River, the longest river in New England, and also the only federally designated Blueways River. But also I-91 dissected the river, and I-84 cut off what is commonly referred to as the 06120, or the poorest zip code in Hartford, from the rest of the city. creating a wasteland for food, and what used to be a thriving commercial community is now the poorest area, and all due in large part because of the isolation created by the I-84-91 intersection, which also replaced massive communities, not only in Hartford, but East Hartford as well. In fact, the I-84-91 interchange is the #1 congestion point and chokehold in Connecticut, New England, number 24 in the nation, #3 in terms of truck traffic congestion along the Buckley Bridge. And Louisiana is, of course, familiar with this in the 9th Ward in New Orleans. When you add in our levees and we look at sandpiping or the potential for collapse, this creates an enormous problem. And so thankfully, this funding and the way that the Biden administration has laid that out, we appreciate everything that you have been able to do. And how can projects like the one we're pursuing in Hartford provide opportunity like you've had and the success that you've had down in Louisiana?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for that question. This project finds itself replicated in cities and towns all across this country because of how we've evolved. IIJA does a phenomenal thing in providing dedicated resources to reconnecting those communities, but it also provides additional discretionary opportunities that these projects might qualify for as well. I've got on my desk really a final assessment of the Claiborne project, and there are a couple of points I'd like to make. First, I think it's important to manage expectations with regard to the scope of work. These projects cost a great deal of money to fix, not just in terms of a state of good repair, but to reconnect, and they're very expensive. And so when Congress acted, as it wisely does, and reduced the program, we will live within the means that you've given us. Also understanding the state of play at the local and state levels in terms of their readiness for these aggressive type projects. And then the third thing is to make sure that this is consistent with the Highway Priority Program. I'm a big believer that you can't boil the entire ocean, or you can't eat an elephant at one time, but you got to take it piece by piece, bit by bit. And that's what these projects will require. Important study, important assessment, and realistic project delivery. Otherwise, we create a false expectation for the people that were already violated in the communities that were separated 50 plus years ago when these projects were originally built.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. This is exactly what we face in the city of Hartford: the isolation, the displacement, and the need for making sure that we have integrated intermodal transportation that links up our rail, our bus, our airport all together, and actually reopens economic opportunity along the Connecticut riverfront as well as in North Hartford. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. And
I thank the
you.
gentleman. Your time has expired. Mr. LaHood, you're recognized for 5 minutes to inquire.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ranking Member Kelly and all of the witnesses today for your testimony.
I can submit for the record that talks about the highway transportation group, the Highway Transportation Agency, Federal Highway Administration.
Okay. Would the gentleman suspend? Would everyone who's not speaking please mute so the person asking the question will be able to be heard? Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today. Mr. Chairman, last month the Consumer Price Index showed that inflation surged to a 40-year high, costing the typical American family almost $5,000 more a year. Under the Democrat leadership in Washington, D.C., out-of-control spending has diminished wage growth, sparked an unprecedented supply chain crisis, and harmed Main Street businesses facing worker shortages and tax hikes. While I have long been an advocate for investing in our hard infrastructure, I was disappointed that our Democrat colleagues approached a traditionally bipartisan issue in a much more partisan way earlier this Congress, linking the infrastructure package with their reconciliation agenda. I agree, we must have responsible investment in hard infrastructure. As I drive through my own district, I see the need for money to help roads and bridges and inland waterway systems. In Central Illinois, farmers, manufacturers, and small businesses utilize our transportation infrastructure to move corn, soybeans, and products all over the world. And while I agree there is the potential for positive economic benefits from responsible infrastructure investment, the investment must be coupled with responsible fiscal policy. Some of the biggest issues I hear from as I travel across Central and West Central Illinois are from small businesses that continue to face unprecedented challenges finding workers. While my Democrat colleagues continue to attempt to cast the infrastructure bill as a boon for the economy, there are many provisions included that concern me. For example, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included a provision that would disallow the Employee Retention Tax Credit, the ERTC, for the fourth quarter of 2021. Many small businesses and nonprofits have continued to take the tax credit into the fourth quarter and now face retroactive tax increase and a complex, frustrating process in reconciling the credit that they will now have to forfeit. As such, I am pleased to co-sponsor my colleague Representative Carol Miller's legislation, the Employee Retention Tax Credit Reinstatement Act, which would reinstate the ERTC through the end of 2021. Additionally, the infrastructure package failed to address the ways to support our supply chain operators, to address the ongoing supply chain crisis and trucking shortage. I recently introduced the Licensing Individual Commercial Exam Takers Now Safety and Efficiency Act. This legislation will help streamline the process to obtain a commercial driver's license and reduce unnecessary red tape. Lastly, I believe it's a bit premature to determine the economic impact of a piece of legislation when many of the programs are not even fully implemented due to the lack of long-term appropriations. Instead of continued government spending on non-infrastructure priorities, members of this committee should remain focused on our efforts to reduce inflationary measures, lower taxes, and cut Washington red tape. As we look ahead, I am committed to addressing these challenges with my colleagues, supporting responsible infrastructure investment and finding common ground to better our nation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I have a question for Mr. McClymans. Mr. McClymans, the number one issue I hear in my district is the lack of workers, particularly truck drivers. I have several companies in my district that would hire hundreds of new drivers tomorrow if they could find the workforce. In your testimony, you mentioned the TCJA, which is the 2017 tax reform bill, and how it benefited your company with lower tax rates. With those savings, did you reinvest in your workforce? If so, can you expand upon that? And can you speak to the challenges and costs associated with obtaining a new CDL? Thank you.
I can, thank you. You know, I bought the business off my dad in 1983, and I've invested all the profits this company's made since then. Every year, the money that we make, we reinvest in the benefits, in the new equipment, in the hire new drivers when we can find them. So yes, the profits of the company goes right back into the company, and that's why it grew over the years. The CDL license today started in 1990. Wasn't a real big deal when it started, but it's getting tougher and tougher. One of my dad's drivers that actually worked for my dad since 1959 retired a few years, probably 5 years ago now. And they changed the regulations some now that if you're colorblind, you can't drive a truck. You lose your CDL license. He drove truck for 50 years almost. And once they changed the criteria, he couldn't do the CDL. So he lost his license, and he was driving for us in the summer after he retired, and that took him away from that. But to get your CDL, you can get it when you're 18 years old, but the insurance companies come in and they don't want them to drive. You can't cross state lines until you're 21, but they want 2 years experience. So that makes them at 23. And I know when I went to high school, 20% of my class went to college and the rest of us went to work. And nowadays it's 90-some% to go to college and maybe 10% go to work. Well, if you can't go,
The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Sanchez, you're recognized for 5 minutes to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I can't thank you enough for holding this important and very timely hearing. I was one of those who proudly helped pass the bipartisan infrastructure law late last year, and I note with some irony that we have colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have argued that building infrastructure for the future, like electrical charging stations, should not be done because that's a special interest. And then I note from others that we shouldn't build infrastructure now because we should be planning for more futuristic infrastructure in the future. And I just find it highly ironic that there's any excuse to find for not supporting this transformative piece of legislation. For those of us who've been fighting for years to rebuild our infrastructure, it's a tremendous breakthrough that promises to make a material difference in the lives of our constituents. For example, the largest transit investment in our nation's history promises to reconnect communities like mine in southeastern LA County that have long been cut off from each other by massive highways for decades. And the unprecedented funding for electric vehicle charging infrastructure promises working families in my community that they don't have to live on the west side of LA to afford to drive an electric vehicle. And the single largest investment in our nation's water systems in history promises to finally address the contamination of water supplies by PFAS chemicals that my community is dealing with. And these aren't empty promises. They are backed up by a generational investment of $1.2 trillion. Now we have a generational opportunity to follow through on our promises for the communities like mine that are too often left behind, and I'm committed to ensuring that we do. I want to commend the Biden administration's early focus on equity and its Justice 40 initiative, but we cannot take our eye off the ball. So I want to focus my time today on what local governments and organizations can do now to get the most out of this robust law. Dr. Wilson, the majority of funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law is being distributed by formula. Many of the cities that I represent have less than 50,000 people and are short-staffed with limited technical expertise. So I want to know, what should they be doing now to ensure that they get their fair share of formula funds like the off-system bridge set aside?
Well, Congresswoman Sanchez, thank you for the question. This is an issue that's very important to me as secretary because I'm known for tweeting out when I close a bridge, whether I own it or whether it's a locally owned bridge. Citizens don't care who owns a bridge when it's broken. They just want to be able to get across it. One of my priority areas is partnering to deliver, which is helping DOTs all across the country prioritize the need to collaborate with locals. Here in Louisiana, I'll give you a testimony of what we're doing. We're going to exceed the minimums that are in IIJA for off-system bridge investments, which is 15%, if I'm not mistaken. We've always had an off-system bridge program that matches federal funds using state transportation dollars that we generate. I expect to be able to fund about $60 million a year over the next 5 years, and that's going to produce over 500 bridges across the state of Louisiana. The vast majority of those bridges are going to be bridges that are important to locals and to the states, and we're going to work to make sure that we have a pro rata share of those poor, very poor bridges in every parish, i.e. county, to make sure that they get their share, and we're going to let them choose. And so DOTs across the state across the country are going to work with locals to make sure that they address those priorities, and reaching out, having those conversations is the first way, I believe, to get it done. And from a Saints fan to a Rams fan, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Go Rams. Thanks so much. Commissioner Sheehan, I recently visited a training center in my district that hosts registered programs for women and formerly incarcerated workers. And one aspect of the bipartisan infrastructure law that I'm particularly proud of, is its investment in workforce development. How can local labor unions engage with state departments of transportation to ensure that we're investing in expanding these apprenticeship opportunities to folks that previously, have not had those opportunities?
Well, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. We as DOTs need to do more to help individuals understand what the opportunities are within the transportation sector. This means going out and meeting with more young people who are considering pursuing different career opportunities, but also beyond our traditional outreach to the construction industry and our partners, we also need to be sharing more about the actual mix of projects that we're advancing and the type of work that is coming down the pipeline. It's not just about how much we're spending every year, it's about exactly how much work is being done in the different categories, whether that's bridge investment, paving, investing in EV charging, so that we can make sure that the workforce is evolving to meet the needs of state departments of transportation. There's been a lot of questions today about preparing for new technology. And so it's not just about the traditional worker sets that we've relied on in the past. It's also about ensuring that we are looking to the future and identifying the skill sets we'll need to be able to operate our systems efficiently and effective in the decades to come.
Thank you,
The
Commissioner,
gentleman's
and I
time
yield
has
back.
expired. I recognize Mr. Arrington to inquire for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Kelly and the witnesses. I think I join almost every lawmaker who believes that our nation's investment in infrastructure is important if we are going to grow and create more jobs and the jobs of the future. And certainly it will also aid the recovery of our country post-pandemic. And when you've got the inflation and the labor shortage and all the headwinds, it would be nice for all of us to make a responsible investment in infrastructure. Here's the problem, and I think Ranking Member Kelly put his finger on it from his previous remarks. This 10 to 15 cents on the dollar goes to core infrastructure, which is what most Americans think of when they support all of us working together to build out, to replace and maintain our infrastructure. So that's the first problem. And so as I look at the title of today's hearing, Examining the Economic Impact of Federal Infrastructure Investment, it begs the question, what kind of return on investment is the other 85 to 90 cents on the dollar going to clean school buses and ferries and legacy pollution projects and subsidies for mineral mining and supply chains that support clean energy technology? I just think with 30 trillion in debt, multiple trillions of dollars that were spent through this COVID time period, this is a time where we have to urgently tighten the belt and refocus and recalibrate how we spend the taxpayers' money. And I just think that this progressive infrastructure bill was a whole lot of waste and too little real core infrastructure. So let's look at the economic impact, and my questions are related to that fundamental issue for this hearing. Mr. McClymans, what is the economic impact to the bureaucratic NEPA and other permitting requirements? And let me just, before you answer, make a simple commentary. It takes 7 years on average to finish a project because of all the hoops and the regulatory rigmarole and the red tape. Everybody that's in this business understands that, and it costs 7 times less to build a road or a bridge in France than it does in the United States of America. So we've got this mountainous weight of regulatory red tape and burden that is costing us a tremendous amount of money. So this infrastructure bill did nothing to streamline that process and actually save taxpayer money and become more efficient in infrastructure. Do you have any idea how to quantify the loss or the negative economic impact of that?
Well, I can't quantify it, but I've experienced it. We build buildings. We've had to go through environmental assessments. We took a couple old properties, old steel mills through Act 2s. And every time I got a price on how much to to take them through in Act 2 so we could reuse the properties, it would be 4 or 5 times over the cost that was originally quoted to us. And it takes forever. Things that they tell you take 90 days takes 18 months. I mean, it's just crazy to get something accomplished through the government regulations.
Well, thank you. It's a big missed opportunity for good government, but there's a list of things. I'll just kind of rattle them off. There's an economic impact negative to federal debt crowding out private capital for infrastructure. My Democrat colleagues said this was paid for. That's baloney. The CBO said it cost $250 billion because most of the pay-fors were just gimmicks. There's a negative economic impact to forcing contracts to go to unions. That's literally an executive order by the president. And lastly, for the record, I submit, Mr. Chairman, a Wall Street Journal article, January 30th, highway funding bait and switch. And this is where they said they're going to put all these projects at the bottom of the pile that actually have to do with new roads and bridges. Just defies any common sense or logic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Moore, you're recognized to inquire for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me join all my colleagues in thanking our witnesses for spending this time with us. I've listened very carefully to the testimony so far, and I am so proud, of course, to have supported the bipartisan infrastructure bill and really looking forward to the economic impact that it makes and the environmental impact that it makes. Before I ask my question, I just really want to make a comment, because a lot of my colleagues have rightfully pointed to the inflation that we're experiencing, supply chain problems that we're experiencing. I just am disappointed that they conflate that with our spending money in the American Rescue Plan, for example, to really rescue people from the increased misery index that this global inflation has caused with the unemployment that came along with it at that particular time. And, you know, I remember listening to Mr. McCarthy's speech for 8 hours and 32 minutes on the floor of the House talking about inflation, and not once did he mention the pandemic. The pandemic is something that has gripped us globally, global-wise, and there's nothing that any one government can do to stop it. It has affected the global energy prices, food prices, supply chain prices. So to say that this is all because we kept people from getting evicted or gave the child tax credit is wrong. R-O-N-G. Plain old wrong. Not W-R-O-N, just wrong. And as a matter of fact, despite the inflation, you know, this inflation is going to ease as we resolve the pandemic. But since then, we've got a higher job rate than we've ever had. People are starting to get back to work. And I won't consume all my time making that argument, because I do have a question. I think I'll address it to Dr. Wilson. One of the horrors that I have had about this infrastructure bill was the notion that you remember the good old Obama days when we gave shovel money to shovel-ready projects. And so the big guys, the big developers got all the money, they spent it building and doing beautiful shovel-ready jobs, and that did not trickle down to the workforce development aspirations that we have. So can you tell me how, Dr. Wilson, we ought to proceed to you know, and not be in such a big hurry to spend this money as soon as it gets to the states, but to make sure we reach some goals with regard to diversifying the workforce? And I will yield for your response.
So great question, Representative Moore. You know, the mantra this time is really about shovel-worthy projects. And I think IIJA wisely made investments in projects that are existing today in terms of investing in states' asset management program. They've made real commitments in terms of making sure that the types of work that we're looking to do are projects that will require DBE participation that can be included in the work that's out there. And then most importantly, they gave us an opportunity to invest in all manner of infrastructure and not just a highway or a bridge. And the element that you've included to give us some time to be able to obligate the funds in the bill by 2024 and for the ARP projects, and then commit to those dates and dollars being spent by 2026 will filter in, I think, to IIJA as states will be flexible and use those dollars for the most important projects. And so I'm encouraged by what we see in the bill, that it gives the states flexibility to fund the projects that are ready to go in projects that are in all aspects, as well as issues of Justice 40 to make sure that they're reaching in the right communities and using the type of resources to invest in infrastructure of all types from a workforce perspective. The local hire opportunities are fantastic for us. We're excited to be able to integrate that into mega projects that we have here in Louisiana. And we've had a law in the books for some time that required us to actually go out and advertise in advance of a project hitting mainstream America to make sure that we focus on those local hires. So we're excited with what we see, and thank you all for passing this bill.
Thank you. The gentlewoman's time
And
is
thank you so
expired.
much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Hearn, you're recognized for 5 minutes to inquire.
I'd like to thank the chairman and Member Kelly for setting up this hearing. Infrastructure is something that's near and dear to my heart. It's not something I just talk about. It's something I've actually lived. I served 5 years as the Finance Committee Chairman of the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority, the largest turnpike in the country by miles, $250 million budget per year, 620 miles of highway, no federal funding. We had to maintain our bond ratings. I know what it costs to build a mile of road, maintain a mile of road, and run a solvent transportation system while meeting debt obligations and satisfying the people who actually pay for the debt, the American taxpayers. And so when I look at this, if you go back and you read the largest headlines in December of 2015, the headlines read, the largest infrastructure bill in modern history, $305 billion has been signed into law. $305 billion as compared to 5 years later, $1.25 trillion, 5 times as much in 5 years. And the reason for that is because the infrastructure in this bill is not legitimate. When you look at every person out there that's looked at this legitimately, it's 10% or less that goes to traditional infrastructure. I know infrastructure has been a central conversation for the last year, but now what we have is inflation on everybody's mind. We should be having hearings on that to see what's going on, but we've had 0 hearings on inflation and what's causing it, because that's what I hear. I've been speaking to groups. I'm sure you all have as well. I doubt they're talking about why the roads are not done. They're asking why it's costing more on everything that they're purchasing. They want to get it fixed. And I certainly get it. Roads and bridges are not political. We all drive on them. And true infrastructure deserves our attention. This whole argument that we had on infrastructure is not about traditional infrastructure. It's always been bipartisan. The conversation here is about all the things that got bolted onto it, things that really doesn't have anything to do with infrastructure. And one thing I like about Dr. Wilson, one of the things I always say that about people, a lot of people I've been working with in DC, a lot of people talk about things they know nothing about. Dr. Wilson, you spent 10 years in Louisiana Department of Transportation. I'm very close with the Department of Transportation Secretary in Oklahoma, who I'm sure you know very well. And it's tough for the smaller states out there. I get it. But you know that you protect those transportation dollars, and you don't want to see them go spent on other things. And I know the role you're in right now, and I get it. But the reality is our infrastructure in America needs a lot of help. And we don't need to be wasting taxpayer dollars on other things. If there's so much passion with my colleagues across the aisle on these other issues, then go run a separate bill on it. Go take and spend the energy on that to run the bills on that, and let the American taxpayers continue to fund infrastructure bills as we could need to see them. When we look at the infrastructure bill of $1.2 trillion, the Association of Inspector Generals, Stephen Street, said he expected to be somewhere around 10% of fraud. That $120 billion is actually larger than Ukraine's gross domestic product. So, this whole infrastructure money it's an alluring target for fraud. We all know it. Anytime we get these massive amounts of spending going out there, we have this issue. So we've got to be concerned about what's going on. We've got to get back to the idea that we're going to actually fund infrastructure and not all the pet projects that are out there. And that's really what's aggravating a lot of people across America. I understand for generations that we've had to give up money that went to our states like Louisiana and Oklahoma to fund bike paths in New York, but that's the way it's been. And now we've gone to another step. Now we're going to fund green new energy deals. We're going to give tax breaks for those companies, and we're going to be punitive to our fossil fuel industry. I want to thank our witness, Mark McClymans, today for testifying before this committee. A gentleman who's just trying to do a job, keep people employed, and keep his business open. And Mark, your testimony highlights how this Democratic infrastructure bill fails to prioritize the investment in our roads and highways. And I know I mentioned in my remarks about the Inspector General. Do you have concern about more of this money in this infrastructure bill going to green energy projects than you do actually going to fix our roads and bridges?
Well, from what I've seen so far, it's exactly what's happening. And it's just like you said, an infrastructure bill should be roads, bridges, riverways, railways, and utilities. I don't think anything else should be in it.
Well, I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I will tell you, I am one of these people that actually agree that we need to be spending the money on our new infrastructure, which is our broadband. I think that's our new electronic highway of the future. So while that's not a traditional, I think that's something that benefits all of us. I'm a huge supporter of the virtual health narrative going forward. I know we have a doctor on here, and I do believe for rural America needs that broadband. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your time. Thank you for allowing us to talk about this. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I recognize Ms. Plaskett for 5 minutes to inquire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. As an individual who lives in a place where climate change is real, I understand more than many others that you cannot have infrastructure if you are not dealing with green energy, if you are not addressing climate change. That infrastructure is not going to be there unless we, in the infrastructure package, which was, of course, as we forget to mention, was passed in a bipartisan manner, both in the House and the Senate. And that is what the American people are looking for. That's what they need from us. And so I'm grateful for the work that this committee has done, that President Biden has done, to ensure that not only are we building, but we're building in a resilient, responsible manner that is going to allow that infrastructure to remain, even after we are gone. I do have some questions, and thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to inquire. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act have added over a dozen new highway programs, and in most cases allows local governmental entities to apply directly to the U.S. Department of Transportation for grants. Many local governments have little or no experience with federal highway grants. What plans do Louisiana and New Hampshire DOTs, and this is a question to Secretary Wilson, Commissioner Sheehan, Mr. Lee, what plans do you have to assist such communities to apply for grants and bring their awarded projects to completion? I'm incredibly concerned that many locations do not have the capacity to fulfill the requirements, particularly in areas where there are competitive grants.
Great question, Representative. Here in Louisiana, we have made it a point to already begin conversations with mayors, municipalities, councils of governments, MPOs to provide what expertise and guidance we have in terms of applying, achieving, receiving, and managing effectively a federal grant. And so we're looking forward to partnering with communities as we have in the past on an infra grant that was applied for by a local government, but implemented on the state system. and we're hand in hand working with them, taking the ownership responsibilities and working with the locals. And so that is a best practice. That is an element of partnering to deliver so that we can reach into smaller communities. And remember, state DOTs already work with those areas that are in rural areas that may not have an MPO or an urbanized area to prioritize their projects that are put into the TIP and the STIP. And so we're excited to be able to help them. And I'll defer to my colleague, Victoria, to provide her comments as well.
Well, thank you for that question. Here in New Hampshire, we really pride ourselves on the relationship that we have with the municipalities that we work with. Based on the ownership of our roadways, many of our main streets in New Hampshire are owned by the state DOT. And we, of course, have to partner in those circumstances to make sure that the projects that we advance meet the needs of the community. We have seen communities struggle over the last several years to obligate dollars when they have received federal assistance. And so we've been doing a number of things to prepare for these discretionary programs. As an example, we have been procuring consultants and assisting communities by giving them access to those consulting firms as they're developing both grant applications as well as advancing the design of projects. We've also been stepping up and offering to manage projects on their behalf. Instead of spending time teaching a community how to follow all the federal rules, if they're not anticipating accessing federal dollars on a regular basis, we are offering to support them, going so far as to manage those projects for them. But
okay, thank you.
Really also advocating to the administration to provide information on how these discretionary grants are going to be awarded. For the new programs in particular, we need the outline of those programs, even if they aren't ready to release a notice of funding opportunity, so that we can identify the best possible candidates to submit in those various categories and make sure we're equipped to be able to access those dollars.
Thank you. I'm running out of time, but I did want to say that I think it's important that we really continue to impress upon the White House the need to have this information and this expertise done in a very equitable fashion, so that we can ensure that many communities are able to access this, not just the ones that have the capacity already to do so. So I thank you all for the tremendous work that you're doing, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Poskett. I recognize Mr. Estes for 5 minutes to inquire.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Kelly, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. You know, my colleagues across the aisle frequently refer to the record-breaking spending as good investment. But as inflation hits a 40-year high and our nation tops $30 trillion in debt, I think it's clear that our spending strategy is anything but a sound investment for taxpayers. As every economist knows, the definition of inflation is just too much money chasing the same amount of goods. You know, bills like their partisan infrastructure legislation are packed full of special interest handouts to many left-wing groups or donors who masquerade as helping average Americans. Billions in subsidies that will allow millionaires in California to write off their new electric car aren't going to help working families in Kansas. It's also been recently reported that the small percentage of the infrastructure bill that was supposed to go towards roads and bridges might not even be used for that. The Wall Street Journal has reported that a memo from the Biden Department of Transportation calls for projects to be deprioritized, which quote, adds new general purpose travel lanes serving single occupancy vehicles. Infrastructure spending sure seems like it will only go towards radical projects more than roads and bridges. How can trillions of dollars in federal infrastructure spending that won't go to expanding roads and bridges be a good investment for my constituents in Kansas? When you add in the Biden administration's broken energy policies, it has created the highest gasoline prices in 8 years, to the trillions of dollars in spending that has caused inflation to soar, it's no wonder why Americans are fed up with Washington, D.C. We're tired of so many in Washington who are treating our mounting debt like their personal credit card, who don't really care that there's no end in sight for their spending and debt accumulation and when it will stop. Mr. McClymans, we know that the 7.5% increase in consumer goods is hurting American families and workers. Besides the price of fuel, what other goods and services has hurt your business and your workers?
Well, virtually everything's gone up. I mean, parts for the trucks, to buy a new truck today, they've gone up more than I've ever seen in 45 years that I've been doing this. Our trailers, everything has gone up, and you can't get parts. I mean, there's stuff that we're waiting on parts for 3 and 4 months. So we have trucks down, and we got to write the manufacturer with a VIN number to even get on the list to get the new ones. It's a real deal. It's been a real challenge.
Is that prohibiting you from actually providing the goods and services that you do to your customers?
Well, between that and the driver shortage, I mean, we're probably down 40 or 50 drivers. We're actively looking for drivers, laborers, welders, mechanics every day. They're hard to find.
Yeah, and it really is. I mean, if you don't have the wrong policies coming out of Washington, D.C., it's really going to have that negative impact that we're seeing in terms of the higher prices and lack of ability for workers to get out and be involved in that. You know, I'm a big advocate for good, legitimate spending for infrastructure. I mean, that's going to be a good investment, but just spending money on special interest projects and giveaway is a terrible use of the taxpayer money. You know, as elected representatives, we should be responsible to be good stewards for the taxpayers' money, and I want to make sure that we implement policies that actually do that. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Ms. Delbaney, you are recognized to inquire for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being here. We really appreciate your expertise and your time. You know, I represent a beautiful district in Washington State, and last November, my district experienced historic flooding that caused severe damage, loss of homes, businesses, livelihoods throughout our region. And we know that the flooding we've seen is going to happen more often. You know, with changing climate, these once in a generation floods are really happening more frequently and with greater intensity. So I want to start off and ask you, Dr. Wilson, I know you have a lot of firsthand experience with flooding in your state as well, and wanted to ask you your thoughts about how the bipartisan infrastructure law can help really improve flood resiliency in our communities.
Great question, Congresswoman. Here in Louisiana, since I've been secretary since 2016, I've closed every major interstate because of disaster, the vast majority of them because of flooding. My first year, we had a 500-year flood in March, a 1,000-year flood 3 months later. The investments in IIJA are going to actually follow a little bit of what the state's done, that we've invested $1.2 billion in a watershed initiative that's going to really deal with watershed management and resilience and mapping and modeling, so that local governing authorities can make the most informed science-based decision with regards to development, with regards to policies and procedures for how they permit developments in their communities. These dollars are going to continue the work of that one-time investment of $1.2 billion by creating a program within our formula funds, as well as providing some discretionary opportunities to address the areas that I know are going to be repeat events just in a 6-inch rain. We can have a 4 or 5 hour rain event here in Louisiana, and there are segments on my interstate that I know are going to flood. So we're in the process of using these dollars to rebuild pump stations that were pumping water from plants built in the 1960s for water that they were never contemplating. We're going to elevate some of those underpasses, provide some bridge structures, and of course, incorporate elevation efforts and other resiliency in all of the projects that we develop. It's a very expensive process, but it takes time. It's got to be systematic, and it's not going to be a one and done effort, especially when you have 16,000 miles of public roads and lots of waterways. So we're committed to doing it, but we're doing it in a science-based, climate-friendly way that's going to use our natural resources to live with water and not necessarily just fight it.
Thank you for that. And I think it's important that we think about it, how important it is to look at it regionally, given that it's not any one community alone. It's the collective set of communities that are impacted, and we have to make broad regional decisions. I also wanted to ask you, Secretary Wilson, my district is a diverse district with urban, suburban, rural communities. And I know you've done a lot of important work in your many roles to advance equity and community partnerships. As we look at advancing equity and look at the new investments from the bipartisan infrastructure law, I wonder if you could talk about what you're particularly excited about there.
Well, great question. I'm good friends with my good friend who's the secretary out there in Washington, Roger Millar. He's actually going to succeed me as president of AASHTO. We share commitments to dealing with equity. The idea that there's this national conversation and that this is being thread through all that we do in this space of infrastructure is very important, because equity is not just about the people who are doing the work, it's about the people we're going to work with. And so where IIJA can incentivize us to diversify our workforce, diversify the people who are doing the work within the departments of transportation, and diversify the benefits. Some of the reparative work that we're going to do with recreating and connecting communities and investing in things like transit and things like broadband, things that will have a long-term effect for those underrepresented populations, I think will go a tremendous distance in terms of leveling the playing field and really being equitable in the impacts of transportation. So I'm very excited about what this means for us, not just today, but my priority at AASHTO is creating pathways to equity. How do we build an institution to address this so it's not a one and done issue? If we're serious about treating all Americans equally, creating that pathway to equity, I think, is going to make that happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. I recognize Ms. Sewell for 5 minutes to inquire. You have to unmute. Terry, you have to unmute. Yeah, still can't hear you. I could read your lips and interpret, but it would take longer. Want me to come back to you? Okay. We'll come back to Ms. Sewell. We'll go to Mr. Kildee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again, for inviting me to participate in this important hearing and for having Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha testify today. And as has been noted, I talk a lot about my hometown of Flint. It's because I care about my community, and it is a place that has seen some really tough times. During the water crisis, the residents of Flint were exposed to these really dangerous levels of lead in their drinking water. It's, as Dr. Mona said, a dangerous neurotoxin, can have lifelong impacts, especially in young children. And so, as I said when I introduced her, it was because of her heroism, exposing those high levels of lead in children, that state officials finally acted and reversed course in Flint. But what happened in Flint is not an anomaly. It's a wake-up call to the rest of the country that we have to get serious about removing lead from drinking water and address the impact of lead on communities. Dr. Mona leads the Flint Registry, which was created by Congress to respond to the water crisis and to connect families to healthcare, to nutrition, and lead removal services that they need to minimize the impact of lead on their health. This is a powerful tool to improve the lives of children and families exposed to lead-contaminated water. And it's also providing help to other communities, including Benton Harbor, Michigan, Newark, New Jersey, and others. We've registered thousands and thousands of people, 25,000 referrals to help. And so to ensure that we can continue this work, I've reintroduced the Flint Registry Reauthorization Act, bipartisan, like this legislation, like the infrastructure bill. It's bipartisan legislation to continue this work for the next decade. So I'd like to ask Dr. Mona, can you just briefly talk about how the Flint Registry has helped to mitigate the impact of lead exposure, which is obviously exacerbated by the fact that there are still so many lead pipes out there, and how the registry serves as a model for other communities that are trying to become lead-free?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Kildee. So the Flint Registry is a public health authority designated by the CDC, and our goal is improving public health. With something like lead, you're supposed to practice primary prevention, which means you're never supposed to expose a population to lead. So we're supposed to find it in the environment and get it out, get those pipes out before kids are ever exposed. but we failed in Flint. That didn't happen. So now our focus is something called secondary prevention. What can we do to mitigate the impact of this crisis? In a sense, this Flint registry is reactive. Like if we didn't have lead pipes, we wouldn't have to support something like the registry. But we still have lead not only in our pipes, but in a lot of our housing infrastructure, paint and soil and dirt and so many environments that disproportionately burden so many children, vulnerable children, especially children of color. So the Flint registry is not just about Flint. This is not a story about Flint. This is a story about Flints everywhere, where once again, infrastructure is making people sick. And we're trying to figure out how to best implement strategies to support people after public health crises and to make sure that kids are no longer exposed to lead.
Thank you. And I know a lot of members of Congress resisted the inclusion of water infrastructure like lead pipe removal from being in this bill. Thankfully, it's in there. What can other communities expect to benefit from? Say we get these lead service lines out. What are the benefits that a community will see as a result of that?
Yeah, so it's in my written testimony, but there are significant returns on investment. For every lead pipe removed, there is about a 33% return on that investment. And that's from decreased special education costs, healthcare costs, mental health care costs, criminal justice, and increased economic productivity. In addition, sometimes I say the most potent prescription I could prescribe to my families in Flint are living wage jobs. So let's not forget that these are good jobs that are hopefully will go to people in these impacted communities, and that will also help them better provide for their families. So significant societal savings, health benefits, and employment opportunities.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Mona. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this really important hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sewell, are you up and going?
I hope so. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Chairman Thompson. And I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. With the passage of the IIJA last year, Congress took the first step in delivering on a long overdue promise for substantial investment infrastructure. Our communities and my constituents and our constituents will definitely benefit from that. But our work is not done. In addition to federal investments, we must also make an investment in helping local and state governments get the resources they need to be able to leverage the federal resources that are in the IIJA. Ensuring that our state and municipalities have access to borrowing tools needed to undertake large-scale projects is a responsibility that falls squarely within the Ways and Means Committee and this subcommittee in particular. I am proud that the framework of the LIFT Act that I introduced last year was a part of the BBB markup by this committee. The Local Infrastructure Financing Tools Act would expand common sense bond financing opportunities for local governments and nonprofits. Therefore, it would provide a number of flexible financing tools that meet the unique needs of communities across this country, including transportation, public health facilities, schools, and other infrastructure and economic development projects. The bill would also provide an opportunity to bring back advanced refundings, which would allow local and state refinancing to take advantage of low interest rates. Dr. Wilson, can you talk to us about how important it is to have both federal investment, but also provide states and especially localities the ability to leverage those federal resources through financing tools like advanced refundings and the like? Likewise, I'd like for you to pick up where your discussion with Congresswoman Plaskett left off, as well as Congresswoman Del Bene on equity issues. The district I represent is the third poorest district in the nation. The median income for a family of four is $35,000 in 2020 terms. It has lots of needs, but amazing constituents. It was my constituents in Alabama, the legacy of my constituency in Alabama, that brought us the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Historic towns like Selma and Birmingham and Montgomery. What my constituents need is not a handout, but a hand up. not only when it comes to better financing tools to help the local governments be able to leverage federal resources, but also when I think about water and sewer. And I want to personally thank Dr. Mona for her leadership and efforts in helping us address that. But in particular, I'd like to know your thoughts, Dr. Wilson, on how we can leverage federal dollars by providing more financial tools like the LIFT Act would do in advance for fundings for states and local governments.
Well, thank you, Representative Sewell. I was just in your state keynoting your transportation conference this last week. I think the financing tools that are being made available through IIJA and others in the LIFT that you've proposed are really important tools. Funding is one thing, but financing is totally different. States all have capacity limits in terms of their traditional debt, but recognizing the opportunities made available through the Build America Bureau, and whether it's Garvey bonds, whether it's the private activity bonds, of which we are advancing a request as we speak because of the increase that you've made to be able to fund the Calcasieu River Bridge in Lake Charles. And we're going to be doing another request for the Mississippi River Bridge here in Baton Rouge, a new bridge in that structure or in that position. Without those financing tools, it's not going to be possible for a state like Louisiana to be able to provide all of the funding or financing that's necessary given what we have. You mentioned the importance of equity and other types of infrastructure. These tools, if applied in the appropriate way, will allow folks to be able to make community-wide changes, whether it's dealing with utilities, sewer systems, water systems, as we've had in Louisiana. Several of them are going to benefit from IIJA. I was just talking to Congressman Troy Carter about that very issue. These tools will make it possible if the states can deliver it. And that's where we talk about partnering to deliver and recognizing the equity of what needs to happen. If you can focus these efforts in those areas, great things can happen. And that's why we want to build that pathway, why we want to partner to deliver. And one of the questions your colleague asked earlier was, how do we work with mayors and local governments? They're the ones that own those assets. And there's a way for us to help them given those tools that you all are making available. IIJA is the first step at that.
Very good. Well, in closing, I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, the LIFT Act was a part of BBB, and as we know, BBB did not get passed. But nevertheless, I hope that this committee, along with the broader Ways and Means Committee as a whole, really take up the fact that these amazing tools, we need to give more tools in the toolkit for borrowing that will help local governments and states leverage these great resources that the federal government is providing. Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. Mr. Schmucker, you're recognized for 5 minutes to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Kelly, for holding this hearing today. I do believe as well, as many of the speakers today, many of the members have said that what we talked about, infrastructure, is important. It's a foundation of a strong economy. It's a core function of government. We need clean water for our residents. We need good highways and bridges, rails, airports. All of this is absolutely critical for a well-functioning economy, and it's a core function of government. So what I'm hearing today on this hearing, I can support. I did, however, vote against this bill, and basically two reasons. One, because of some of what was in the bill, and then secondly, because of the context. And someone brought, I think it was Ms. Moore, that brought up what we've come through with the pandemic. Absolutely devastating. And we did need to respond to that. I was very proud of us working in a bipartisan basis, first of all, to ensure that we had a vaccine in record time that has essentially defeated the pandemic. And then we provided, through the CARES Act, with almost unanimous bipartisan support, funding that was very much needed for people who were impacted by the pandemic. That was necessary and was about the right amount. Where I think Democrats went off the rails, and why I couldn't support this bill, is they then loaded up with trillions of dollars in additional spending that was not an accurate response. It was not the response needed to the pandemic. Rather, it included a huge wish list of policies they've been looking to implement for some time, using this as an excuse to do so. and did it on the backs of future generations. At the least, we're going to have our kids and grandkids pay for this, at the least. And I think there's a very real risk to the future of the country in terms of our economy. You just simply can't spend money and print dollars that we don't have without having a severe impact. We've seen what happens to countries that spend more than they have and print dollars. It does not end well. So I couldn't support this bill in that context. It spends too much. Wall Street Journal said, it's been brought out before, less than 25% of this bill goes for what you're all talking about here today, which we all support. So that's why I couldn't spend the bill. And then there were a lot of handouts in this bill that were essentially political giveaways. For instance, the administration, the president, did an executive order on February 3rd that mandated that taxpayer-funded infrastructure projects paid with this bill, be done through project labor agreements and restricting 87% of the construction workforce from participating and working on these jobs. Now, how does that make any sense? How does it make any sense? In fact, Ms. Moore also talked about inflation. It didn't come from the pandemic. It came from the response to the pandemic. It came from the spending that we're seeing. And in the same way, restricting the funding to allow only union labor on these jobs will result in a price increase as well. Why would we not want to use the taxpayer dollars in the most efficient way possible? But instead, what we're seeing is Democrats giving their union cronies a handout here. That's what it is. I ran a non-union construction company. We don't have a lot of unions in my area for years. Very high safety record, very good use of taxpayer dollars when it was a government-funded program. In fact, there's a letter, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to include for the record from Associated Builders and Contractors, if I may. Mr. Chairman, a letter.
Without objection, such will be the order.
Thank you. They talk about, in this letter of a study that says PLAs for federally and federally assisted construction projects increase the cost by as much as 20%. And it makes sense. If you're restricting supply, costs will go up. So why would we not want to use the taxpayers' dollars in the most efficient way possible? There's also a study by the RAND Corporation. And in this case, it looked at the effects of PLAs in the production of affordable housing. That study concluded that the use of PLAs increased construction costs and led developers to propose smaller projects, ultimately resulting in approximately 800 fewer affordable housing units being built. These are the kind of policies that are included in this bill. These are the kind of policies that Biden is requiring through his executive order, and it makes no sense whatsoever for the taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I recognize Mr. Snyder to inquire for 5 minutes on the bipartisan infrastructure bill that we passed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you first for holding this hearing and second for allowing me to join you. I was very proud when we passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act last fall. Proud to vote for it, proud to see it signed by the president, and proud to see the effects it's having in our communities. I want to thank our witnesses today for sharing your expertise and experiences. I think it's incumbent on our committee to demonstrate to the American people all of the benefits and dividends we will see through this new law and what is the biggest federal investment in infrastructure since the Eisenhower Highway program. And Mr. Chairman, as you noted, this is a bipartisan bill. 13 of our House Republican colleagues voted for the bill, 19 Senate Republicans, 38% of the Republicans in the Senate voted for this bill. I would call that fairly bipartisan. Now, when we talk about infrastructure, I often joke that, well, I don't make a joke. The fact is our infrastructure has gotten C, D grades over the last number of decades. My joke is that the only reason we're still getting that C grade, if at all, is because of grade inflation, not because of improvements to our infrastructure. We have had to make infrastructure investments across our nation for a generation or more now, and it's critical that we make those investments now. I want to particularly applaud the climate conscious investments in this law, including investing in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And I'm eager to connect communities in my district to federal funds that will replace lead service lines and make sure everyone's drinking water is safe and secure. And from this pandemic, we have seen the impact of working from home. And I'm able to speak with high-speed internet on this call. Thankfully, it's reliable. There are far too many communities that don't have access to high-speed internet or internet at all, and we have to make sure that we get to all of them. Mr. Chairman, I also want to touch on, there's been a lot of talk about this canard that only 10% of the infrastructure is going, 10% of the bill is going to infrastructure. And I want to quote an article from the Washington Post, Glenn Kessler on November 9th, evaluating the claim, and he concludes with the following. No matter how you slice it, the claim that the infrastructure bill is only 11% real infrastructure is simply false. More than 1/3 of the bill would qualify as infrastructure under the standards used by Trump during his presidency, but many more elements could be considered infrastructure, bringing the percentage as high as 80%, end quote. And he goes on to give the claim of only 11% infrastructure for Pinocchio's, its most critical rating of disingenuity, I suppose. And I want to emphasize, this is from Ernst & Young, or EY, the accounting firm's assessment of the bill. 110 billion goes to roads and bridges, 39 billion to public transit, 66 billion to railways, 73 billion to our power grids, 7.5 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure we talked about, another 7.5 billion for electric buses, ferries, 42 billion for airports and waterways and inland seaways, 50 billion for resiliency and climate change, 55 billion for drinking water, $65 billion for broadband internet. These are all things that are critical to our infrastructure, critical to our future, investing in our kids, investing in our future, and making sure this nation continues to lead for the long term. And with the little bit of time I have left, if I could turn to you, Mr. Lee, could you perhaps give your perspective on how much of this bill is going to real infrastructure, quote unquote, and what impact it's going to have for our future?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Brookings Institution recently did an analysis on this as well, as you quoted Washington Post. We're looking at 70% of the entire bill going to hard infrastructure on transportation assets, 12% to energy, 6.6% to broadband, 3.2% to water, and 3% to watershed and coastline improvements. So that's over 90% of the dollars going to hard infrastructure. I would also like to point out that one of the key asks from AASHTO to Congress for IIJA was to increase flexibility, reduce program burdens, and improve project delivery. There is the effort to improve the environmental review and permitting process by including one federal decision to allow for interagency coordination, concurrent, not sequential reviews, get the major projects reviewed in 2-year timeline, improve state, federal oversight, and stewardship and coordination as well. So we believe there are a lot of elements there to protect the environment, but speed up the process to really deliver on the benefits of the IIJA.
Great, thank you. And as my time closes, let me just quote General Patrick Moynihan. And I hold my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on this committee in the highest regard. It is a great privilege to work with them and try to do what is in the best interest of our country. And I know that we may have different perspectives and experiences, but as General Patrick Moynihan said, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. And the facts are that this bill invests in our country. It's far more than what is being claimed by the other side. We should work together and make sure that those investments are put to the best possible use. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder, and thank you, Dr. Wilson, for laying bare the facts as to how this money is spent. And it was unfortunate that there was so much misdirection in regard to the distribution of the funding and the fact that it was a bipartisan bill, although all Republicans didn't vote for it. It was a bipartisan bill. I want to really thank the witnesses. You did a wonderful job. Thank you very much for taking your time to be with us today to lay out how important this bill is to America today and in the future. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal record. With that, our subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you very much and be safe.